Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the April Spark session. We're so glad to have you here. I had no idea when I decided, hey, let's talk about podcasting, that so many people would be interested in this topic. It was kind of a surprise. We got a lot of questions in advance. Usually we get more of the questions in the Q&A time, but this time we got a whole bunch of questions in advance, which means some of you have noticed an uptick in podcasts and the success of podcasts in the area. And I think that is because our technology finally caught up, right? So it's really easy to get your podcast on this device, and it's really easy to hook this device up to your car now, and it's really kind of nice when you're driving not to hear a bunch of commercials. And sometimes you don't want to just listen to music, so you pop on a podcast, and it's like a really nice way to keep yourself awake and keep yourself engaged, maybe learn something along the way. So they've just kind of come into their own. It's kind of like podcasts in 2008 were like BlackBerry was when it first came out. And what was that, around 2001, 2002, somewhere in there. And everybody had a BlackBerry. They were kind of using a BlackBerry. And then the iPhone came and screwed everything up for BlackBerry. They're basically not even a viable company anymore because this replaced it in a different way. Well, with podcasts, I think what's happened is in 2008, it was kind of like people who listened to podcasts were like the people who had the Blackberries, and they had, the ability to figure out, maybe they had one of these, like an MP3 player that they were listening to while they were jogging or while they were doing things in their yard, but the interface to the car just hadn't really happened yet. And so it was only like the really cool tech savvy people who had worked podcasting into their lives. Well, that's all changed now. Most of us, if our car is 5 years old or younger, we've got a Bluetooth interface to our phone or an auxiliary jack that you can plug in with an 1/8" in. So people are just listening to more podcasts, and not everybody has time to read a bunch of stuff. I know in our network, we all love to read. I've seen the data. When your target audience is think tank people, you should write things down. You can give them video, you can give them audio, but you should totally write things down because think tankers apparently like to read. So anyway, today we'll be talking about podcasting. I'm going to talk a little bit first about should you even bother. Then we're going to go through some lessons I've learned in starting my podcast, which is livingfreeintennessee.com. And then we'll go into the tech, equipment, hosting, distribution, and promotion. I'll take questions along the way. If you have a question for me, pop it in the Q&A thing. I think it's at the bottom of your screen. It's at the top of mine. It says Q&A. If you put it in chat, I may or may not see it. A couple of times I have not seen that, but I'll try to keep my eye on chat today as well. Okay, so let's dive in. Should I have a podcast? That is the number one question. And I know some of you today who have sent me questions already do have a podcast and have more advanced questions. But to an organization in our network, the question about if you should have a podcast is one you should think carefully about. And it's like anything else you do at your think tank. It's something that can be a really powerful promotional tool, right? If you find the right way to reach your target audience with a podcast, you can get some pretty diehard supporters. You can convert them into contributors or into volunteers. It's a really great way to connect with your audience. And it's especially good if you're able to make that personal connection through the audio system, right? So in order to do it successfully, you need to build in not only the information of your think tank, but a little bit of personal character so that you really reach those people. There's a downside, though. The downside is a podcast can take time. I mean, it does take time. My podcast takes 4 to 6 hours a week. And the first one took me 2 days. Okay, I have it down to a system now, but the first couple episodes took a long time. And that means that, if it's, do you have that time? And of course, as we always say at Spark Freedom, does it fit your copy strategy for your organization and your goals? So if your goal from your organization involves getting a groundswell of people interested, engaged, and activated into your network, it's potentially really a good thing for you to do. If your organization's plan revolves simply around personal connections with legislators, it may not be the best tool unless you can produce the content that legislators will listen to week over week. So I think it's a really good opportunity to connect with people, especially if your target audience is broader than, 87 people. But at the same time, you have to weigh that against all the other ways that you are reaching out. And so, that's pretty much the answer we have to any question, right? Like, should I redo my website? Well, how does it fit your brand? And does it reach your people? Should I do a podcast? Same question. Should I go on a radio show? Different audience. So, ask yourself, are the people we want to reach podcast listeners, what are they doing while they listen? Are they driving? Are they, like for mine, they're probably working in their gardens if they're listening to Living Free in Tennessee, because we're focused on freedom and homesteading. So I know because of that information how long to make my podcast. If it's driving, like how long is the average commute? Okay, a little bit shorter than that would make for pretty good length for your podcast. So you see how these questions answer a lot, like answering the first question, who am I reaching? What is it going to do? How does it serve our purpose? Answers a lot of other questions about length, which distribution networks to use, what format to distribute it in, how high of a quality your audio needs to be. And then the other thing you want to put in there would be, how does it fit into your pipeline? And this is something that a lot of us forget to think about. And I've stopped hiding that we are salesmen or women, salesmen and women. We are selling something to somebody, or we aren't doing our job, right? So what are we selling? Who are we selling it to? And how does my podcast get more leads to come over to what I need them to do, whether that be signing petitions, getting out for volunteer support, contributing to the organization, organizing groups in their community, whatever your thing is. So that's a very important piece. If you've decided to do it, now look at your pipeline. How do you get leads into your organization? How do you divide them up between potential donors or volunteers or message ambassadors who are going out and taking your work and getting more people interested in you? And then how does that get taken care of from there? Because you can do a podcast and it won't get you anywhere if you're not linking it to the people power, right? And then finally, the other thing is, can you create compelling content on the same schedule every week or every day? I don't know how long, for a whole year, without having your president of your organization or your board of directors get mad at you because you don't have enough viewers. Because when you start a podcast, no one is listening. And this is a direct quote from a friend of mine who's a very successful podcaster, has 150,000 listeners. His listeners often ask him, how do I start? How do I take care of all these things? What if I get lots of questions? And he's like, just start your podcast, because no one is listening at the beginning, and they're not going to be for a while. Sure, that first episode, if you have a lot of online friends, you may get somebody to listen to. Like my first episode of Living Free in Tennessee, I had 90 listeners first day. That's kind of unprecedented. The next episode, I had 21, and the one after that, I had 11, and I stayed at 11 for a long time. When I started Living Free in Tennessee, I purposely didn't put any advertising into it of any kind, because I wanted to do an organic growth model so that I could share that with all of you. And so I saw what worked and what didn't work. And the hardest part is getting through the first 9 or 10 episodes when you see your stats and it's like, my mom listened, my dad listened, everybody at the organization I worked for listens, and a couple of close friends, and then one random person. Like there was a time where I knew everybody who was listening to Living Free in Tennessee, and now I don't. So I do see somebody's popped in with a question. I'm going to read it and just answer it. I will answer today questions as we go, which is different than usual. I usually take them at the end, but a lot of, I think there will be a lot of questions today. So this is from Tim. We are in the process of starting a podcast for PRI. Hi Tim at PRI. One debate we are having this week was whether we should have an announcer in the opening and closing. Is there any school of thought on this? From your and others' experiences, does it hinder or help your podcast in any way if you have a slick announcer come on at the beginning or end? Also, any best practices on that? Well, Tim, I think it depends on what your podcast is. Is it people talking about policy issues or freedom? Like, what's the content? I don't think you need to have a different announcer from the people in the podcast. People listen to podcasts because of the personality on the podcast. And so I think what you should look at, rather than cool announcer at the beginning and end, like who's your ambassador? Who's the person that brings people through the podcast process and tells the story? Because in a podcast, the best way to make headway is to tell stories and to have that personality you can revolve it around. Now, I have seen some successful podcasts more on like a radio production scale, where they have different segments throughout, where they're interviewing, Timmy Terminator about his ranch, and they're interviewing Julia about her corporate job, and it's all related to one topic. And even in those, like, this is NPR podcasts, right? Even in those, they have an announcer or a podcast host who walks people through the whole process. So I'd say, rather than thinking, do I need somebody at the beginning and end, think about that position as who or what combination of who at your organization will be the host for the whole thing that connects everything together so that your listeners feel like they're having an experience. Because like any presentation, you want the introduction, you want the body, and you want the close. You want people to know what's coming. You want them to get to know you. And if they get to know you and like you, they'll listen to you even if you do funky things along the way. So I think the best practice is to have that ambassador. Now, do I have statistics to back this up? No, but I probably can find them, because I've listened to a lot of podcasts, and I haven't heard one where there's like the voice of God announcer and at the end too. I've never heard that happen, and there's probably a reason I've never heard that happen. I'm also not like, I guess I listen mostly to more popular podcasts, and that's in fact a really good way to learn about what works well in a podcast and what doesn't. But Tim, back to the first point, and this is like, I'm just going to dive into lessons I've learned from doing Living Free in Tennessee. I have 8. The first lesson is just do it. So you can sit around and debate with your staff as long as you want, and you probably don't want to, but the key is to get something put together. Now, a lot of podcasts have sort of a little jingle at the beginning introducing the podcast. I think that's great. I think it should be super short, though. Super, super short. Mine is 9 seconds that goes into my podcast. And I've had that since the beginning, but I kind of had a leg up on that at the beginning because I was a rock musician for 15 years, and I'm very comfortable with recording software. I have a database of music to which I own the copyrights. So it was very easy for me to put sort of that introduction segment. And from that standpoint, I think it is a good idea to have something, either a jingle or a thing that just announces the podcast. So I don't know if that's what you were sort of asking. I wouldn't say at the end. At the end, have your host say, and wrap up what's going on, and then you can do either music on the way out or nothing. I end my podcast with the same outro every time, and that's make it a great week. Because I think, part of my podcast, the goal of it is to empower people to be self-sufficient, and I think they are in control if they have a good week or not. So I always say make it a great week. That's my thing. I don't know what your thing will be at PRI, but I'm pretty sure with the good staff you have there, y'all can come up with something pretty interesting. So that's the answer to Tim's question, probably longer than Tim expected. Okay, so 8 lessons learned. 1, just do it. Get off your tail, do it. If you go back and listen to early Living Free in Tennessee, I was not using this microphone. In fact, I'm not using it right now. I was using the built-in mic on my computer, and everybody said, the audio won't be okay. Okay, it wasn't great. It wasn't horrible. I made sure I was in a quiet room. I made sure the dog wasn't barking in the background. and I just got something started, because the hardest part, I think, about the podcast is kind of getting all the pieces to work together and learning your system. Once you learn your system, it gets easier and easier, less and less time, until you realize how much time it takes to create content, and then you start getting a little bigger too. So second lesson is use what you have on hand. A lot of questions we got this week are about what technology to use, and I'll answer that later in the tech session. And there are some fairly inexpensive options. The best way to control your audio quality is to control the environment in which you are recording. So, if you're recording on a street corner, you're going to hear car noise. If you're recording in the house when the baby's crying, then you're going to hear the baby crying. If you're recording in a very quiet room that doesn't echo too much, that's half your battle right there. And then it doesn't matter if you use this mic or another mic. Apparently can you hear that? I need to oil that. Anyway, so that's the second thing. Use what we have on hand. I happen to already have audio software on my computer. It's a Mac. And so I use that. I didn't buy anything special. I had everything on hand I needed to get started. And eventually I finally bought a piece of equipment to interface from that microphone to my computer, because that microphone I have from singing in a rock band. And I figured, why buy a different mic if I already have one, right? And it works great. It's one of the many recommended condenser mics that people use. The third lesson is define your core and stick to it. And any of you who have been around Spark Freedom for very long know we basically say that about everything. Okay, so this is your copy strategy. This is what you want to be communicating to people every time you do anything. For Living Free in Tennessee, the core concepts are that you can take control of your life and make it better. You can design the lifestyle you want. And it's also informational. I'm going to convey you ways we've done it on the homestead through growing our own food and raising animals and those sorts of things. Okay, that's a niche. That's obviously not a think tank target audience, although many of you do have farms. And that works for Living Free in Tennessee. We're sharing our experiences of being freedom-loving people in Tennessee. Well, your core may be different. It may be that you want to convey that people will be more empowered through less regulation. That may be your thing. And if that's the case, make sure that fits into any theme you do. If you do that, you won't have like listener confusion. Okay. The fourth lesson was not all podcast hosts are the same. And by host, I mean hosting solutions for the audio. Find a good one and learn what they do well. When we get into tech, I'll go into a little bit more on hosts, but sometimes the free solution is not the best solution. So like SoundCloud, you can host audio on that for free up to a certain amount, but you lose all rights to your audio. So you need to think about, does that matter or not? And choose your host carefully. If you have enough budget to host it yourself, that's the best solution. It's just that if you get super popular and have 150,000 downloads, you're looking at a yearly audio hosting bill. I think I heard it's $600 a month right now for my friend who has a successful podcast. So that's no chump change. And if you're going to go down that road, it better be feeding into your pipeline so you can pay the $600 a month. Lesson number 5. Make sure you have thought through your equipment.
I have Chestnut holding her hostage in the house.
This is a surprise addition to our call. I have a CB on my phone for people who live in the area, and they occasionally tell me things. So that was a surprise addition from Peaches down the road. Anyway, 4 areas to consider are equipment, content, production, and marketing. We should put marketing first, right? This is actually the first time I think you should put marketing second, but make sure it's high up on the list. Get your content dialed in. Get it dialed in really well. If your content is good, everything else will come. You will figure out how to produce it better. You will figure out how to market it well, and you will figure out which equipment best fits what you need. Okay, lesson number 6. Delivery of your content is the most important thing. The content has to be good. The delivery has to be better. And that is something that develops over time. And the way that I have worked on that is I make myself listen to my podcast, and I hear the ums and the ahs and the hums and the, oh, she didn't move her voice. She spoke in a monotone the whole time. Okay, so like all of those things matter. The one thing that I had a leg up on, I'd say, from other podcasters in sort of the homesteading world, is a lot of them go straight for the informational and don't tell stories at all. Well, okay, so we've been working in the Liberty world I've been working in the Liberty world for 12 or 13 years, and the whole time been encouraging people to tell personal stories about people hurt by bad policy, stories about people helped by good policy. The whole time. We even have workshops that like walk you through how to put the best story together for your policy, right? So I had this method that we've been teaching for many years where we tell stories. We say, Timmy Terminator was hurt and was in the Medicaid system, and he was put in a dark room, put on psychotropic drugs, and was going to die. And except for that, by some happy accident, this is actually Moist Brutus, by the way, for those of you who follow FGA, by some happy accident, he was enrolled in a private option. And because of that, he got a counselor who assessed his needs, got him the prosthetics he needs, got him into a support group. They linked him up with like an animal companion. And now Moise is, not only is he thriving, he's getting the medical attention he needs. It costs taxpayers less money. And he's studying to be an ambassador for that same system that helps be our navigator for that system. Okay, so these stories like that on policy, if you can really twist the knife, right, they do well. And so in your podcast, think about that. Like if you're talking about your organization's reaction to the latest budget in your state, well, think about how that relates to a story, either a story about you, a story about people you know, something you read in the paper. Bring at least one story every 8 to 10 minutes. I do more than that a lot of the time, but every 8 to 10 minutes in your podcast, and paint pictures. Like, think, how can I speak visually with my words? When we're talking about homesteading, how can I explain that yesterday my hive split it? So I had split this hive and they swarmed yesterday, which almost never happens. It's my fault for not going in. I walked out and there was this like tornado of bees flying out of the hive up into a tree. And I knew right away what that meant. Ran around the property looking for my bee suit, put it on, got my gloves, made a frantic call to a bee mentor to find out what to do, and went back up to the hive. And okay, so you see how you start getting sucked in with the visual words, right? Do that on your podcast, because on your podcast, they don't have anything to see. You can be a little lazy with video and show the pictures, but if you paint the picture with your words in a podcast, you get a lot more engagement. And it teaches you what you can do in video better, because when you paint video pictures like with your words on video and have the visual, it's even more compelling. Okay, this one's good. This one relates to a lot of questions I've had about promotion. Lesson number 7, network, network, network. Always be reaching out to other podcasters who will cross promote you. Reach out to bloggers who will talk about your podcast. Get yourself covered in the paper. Heck, I just took an ad out in the paper. I finally decided I would stop doing organic only, and I put an ad in a paper that's targeted at farm people. Okay, just network. Get out there and highlight people on your podcast that you think are good. Like that back and forth. Podcasting is kind of like blogging was, 8 years ago, where everybody was starting a blog. People were monetizing them. It was awesome. And the best way to be successful was to cross promote other bloggers. Same with podcasting. That really can help you get up and running. And if you know other think tanks in the network who have blogs, you can cross promote each other. You're probably willing to right out of the chute, right? So that's a really great thing to build into your podcast. And then the last thing, which is not least at all, it's the most important, is block time and be consistent. If you are going to produce your podcast every Friday so people can listen to it going into the weekend, produce your podcast every Friday. It's funny. I was talking to somebody over at Fee the other day about their vlog. They have a blog, like blog with a V. And they decided they wanted to do one. And the first thing he said was, well, if you're going to do a vlog, you need to prove to me you can do it every week on Wednesday and turn it in on time for a month. And then we'll talk about how we're promoting it. And I thought that was really smart, because if you launch this awesome podcast and you do 3 episodes and then you stop because it's just too much, well, you're not, like, you just put all this resource into it. It doesn't make your brand look very good or stable. And that whole blocking time thing can take a little while to figure out. And so when I spoke to Fee about this, they had already gotten through okay, we know we can do it every week. We've got the editing down. We're producing content. We're getting it out once a week. Now we can talk about how are we going to promote this in the long term? What are our user goals going to be? How are we going to reach more people? I thought it was really smart advice. And I know to produce my podcast, I basically go into shutdown mode for starting at 10 a.m. Monday until it's done. And sometimes it's done at 1 p.m. and sometimes it's done at 4 p.m. And it's sort of unless there's an emergency, it's talk to the hand. I don't look at email. I don't look at anything, because that's what I have to do to get it done. Now, if you're doing a Friday podcast, might want to record, like, have that time on Wednesday so it's ready to release Friday. You might want to do it the same day you release it. I chose Monday as my day because that's a good day for my listeners to download it. In fact, if I was going to do a second one once a week, it would be, so twice a week, it would be Thursday, because then they can download it and listen to it on the weekend while they're working in their gardens. Anyway, so those are my 8 lessons learned from that was done after the first 20 episodes of the podcast. So let's jump into the meat now. And remember, if you have a question, just pop it in the Q&A area. First, I want to talk about tech, because it seems like almost everybody I talk to about a podcast gets a little worried about the technology. Really, all you need will be mixing software, something like Audacity. A lot of people use Audacity, I don't know how you say it, to do their podcast. You know what I use, though? I use GarageBand. I use GarageBand because I already had it on my computer and I knew how to use it. And I thought, well, why get Audacity when I already have GarageBand and know how to use it? So Audacity is probably more tailored towards a podcast type thing. GarageBand, you're seeing music measures and it goes in time. Use whatever you're comfortable with. I mean, frankly, if you want to record it in iMovie and just export the audio, you can do that. It's really all you need to do. But choose something that you can learn. If you don't know anything about audio, you can go to YouTube and Google how do I using Audacity to edit a podcast, and within probably 10 minutes of watching a 12-year-old kid do it, you'll be fine. You'll be good to go. The next thing you need is a microphone. Actually, I'm not going to talk about the microphone yet. A condensing program. What's that? Well, when you record a podcast, sometimes you interview people. Sometimes you stop halfway through and take a drink of water and kind of shake it off and then get back in there. And so one segment may be quieter than another segment. And in GarageBand and in Audacity, you can turn the volume up and down to make it consistent, or you can export, like you could do your whole podcast, you can get the final product ready to go editing wise and export it to a WAV file. Now, don't ever upload it as a WAV file or your listeners will hate you, but .wav, and throw that through a program called Levelator. And what Levelator does is it compresses the whole thing. So it makes the loud stuff a little quieter and the quiet stuff a little louder so that you fit in this margin of error and you're not like, your listeners aren't hearing like super loud intro and then super quiet person talking, right? That was something I was doing wrong in several of my early episodes where it was like super loud and then super quiet. And a couple people complained. that was a recommendation. That Levelator program, you can have it for Mac or PC. That was a recommendation from Jack Spirko over at the Survival Podcast. That's what he uses to just squish it down, and it takes a lot less time than tailoring your audio up and down. So that's a second piece of tech. And while we're talking about Levelator, let's talk about audio quality. Audio quality in your exported file, meaning like, do you export it at 128 kilobits or whatever it is, or is it 60 something, 62? What I know about podcasting is that most people are not listening to it on a premium stereo system. So the smaller you can make the file, the happier I am with my data usage on the phone for your podcast. So I listen to a guy who sometimes talks for an hour and a half, right? An hour and a half file that's huge, like that's got the highest audio quality possible, could take forever to download on my network, and it's putting me over my data. This guy exports it to the lowest quality possible in his program, and it's fine. It sounds good. His voice sounds good. Why? It sounds good because he's using a decent microphone, he's in a quiet room, and he's put it through Levelator. So don't get all twisted up about the ideal audio. Just find a way to have that quiet space. So that's the tech side. I'm not going to talk about hosting yet. That's a totally different thing. Equipment, which I was starting to jump into. This is the first question. What microphone do I use? And the best answer I can get you, and I actually pulled it up here, is don't buy this mic. This is a Rode, what are you? You're a Rode NT1. This is a great condenser mic. It comes with this, it's got a pop filter on it so I don't go make pee noises that make your eyes blow out of your head. And it has this little suspension, rubber band suspension thing so it doesn't get knocking noises as you're talking. And the reason I use this mic is I already had it. This is, I think, a $287 mic, and it's completely unnecessary to what we're talking about here. This is the Samson C01U recording podcasting pack. I've not used this, but it is recommended by almost every podcaster I've talked to who didn't already have a condenser mic sitting in their desk drawer. And this goes straight to USB, so you don't need any separate equipment. So for this, all buying options, you've got, $139 to $359. That's a used one. I'd totally do that. You can also buy, so it's like $139 investment. If you Google around, you can find these for like $100. If what you have around your office is a Shure SM58, by all means, use it. And then what I had to do to get this microphone that was in a drawer to work was I had to buy an interface box. I didn't buy a mixing board. I didn't do anything crazy. I just got this little Focusrite Scarlett Solo. If you're planning to do interviews, though, don't buy this. They make another one that allows you to have 2 audio inputs and go back and forth. Solo is just, solo, one person. But this $99 device allowed me to take what I had and go into my computer. It was a little bit cheaper than the Samsung, and it works really well. It allows me to, you can see like you have the gain there that allows me to turn the volume up. I could plug in my guitar if I wanted to, not planning to do that. And then it'll hook up to a monitor if I want to have headphones to hear. At the moment, I don't do that. I could, but I don't. And I'm seeing a chat comment. So anyway, somebody just told me to make sure you guys know I'm doing a share screen. So I was actually showing you the equipment as I talked about it. So this is the Focusrite box. And let's see, I'm having a little things in the way. And then this is the Samsung C01U pack. Again, if you have something, use it. Use it for the first 20 episodes and then decide if you need to upgrade, because no money is better than some money, right? And then, of course, I had the Rode NT1, which is great. Now, let's talk about hosting your podcast. So I think I mentioned before, you can use a service, and the service I use is Libsyn. This is an example of Libsyn right here. And, you know, I log in, it shows me different statistics and that sort of thing. If I want to add an episode, I'm showing you on the screen again. I just add the episode, upload the master file, hit publish. And the cool thing about this is it automatically sends it out on a number of networks. So that's why I use it. However, I do a hack here, and I will actually show you the hack that I do. What I do is, instead of they have a built-in blog that you can use. I don't want that. I want people who listen to my podcast to go to my website, livingfreeintennessee.com. So when I publish an episode, I put in what's called a custom permalink. And that's just if somebody sees it in a feed and wants to go to the blog page automatically, it will take them either to the Libsyn blog site that's set up for my podcast, or I can tell it to do something else. I've told it to go to livingfreeintennessee.com and go to that specific URL. So when I'm publishing, I make sure I'm driving everything back to my website because I don't want to lose the traffic. Now, I'm getting to a point where we will probably transfer over to our own hosting solution. I'll probably go to HostGator, and then none of this will matter. But from the standpoint of lesson number one, just do it. Starting by publishing on Libsyn allowed me to not worry about, is it going to be on, you know, have I successfully made it to iTunes? Well, look, there I am on iTunes, right? Well, part of why I'm there, I didn't have to fuss with a lot of iTunes settings. I just used the Libsyn interface to get there. You know, am I on Stitcher? Well, yes, I'm on Stitcher. I could just drop the feed in. And so it just really made it easier as far as distribution out of the chute. As I've gotten further into the podcast, I'm doing more of my own promotion to cast a wider and wider net. But really, you know, starting with the basics happened very easily through Libsyn. And I chose them because of the intellectual property rights. They're allowed to use my stuff, but they don't own my stuff when I put it on there. So I was more comfortable with their terms of use than some of the other systems that they have. So that's hosting. That's probably the hardest thing to think about. Now, if you host it on your web host that you already have, just be aware that a lot of data is transferring. Like, my average episode is probably 30 to 50 megabytes, which isn't huge, except for if it gets downloaded 1,000 times, it starts getting big. And most hosting solutions charge you based on how much data you transfer. This is why a lot of people will have a different host for audio and a different host for their website. Like for me, WP Engine is where my website's hosted. And even when I go to a hosting option, I'm not going to put the audio on WP Engine. I will probably put it on HostGator because they have pretty good prices. Just because the only thing I really needed to do is house the audio files. I don't need it to work well with WordPress. I'm doing that already on WP Engine. So, but I don't want to pay WP Engine's rates for all that audio because there's a lot of data transfer once you start taking off. So that's my thoughts on hosting. Distribution. I think everybody should make sure they're on Stitcher, iTunes, Podcast Addict, which is an app on the phone, and YouTube. Those are the 4 I would make sure you're on out of the chute. And then from there are hundreds and hundreds of different podcast networks that you can use. Look at the ones that people who are going to listen to you are likely to use. Now, you can, like, as an organization, look at your web traffic. Which mobile browsers are they using to listen to you? Or not to listen to you, to view your website. If, like we are, 80% of your traffic is coming from an iOS device, which means it's either an iPad or a phone, then you need to be on iTunes. iTunes is the biggest pain in the neck to get on, by the way. They have because it's Apple, and they have very specific parameters on how big your thumbnail should be and blah, 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 blah. So, and the feed has to be just right. All of that for me was done on Libsyn. I'm going to have to redo it when I move to hosting, but iTunes was probably that is still my biggest downloader of the podcast, and then Stitcher, which is up on my screen right now. That one's the second biggest. And then from there, people download it directly from livingfreeintennessee.com, which is just that, it's a player that I have. If you are not using a host like Libsyn to do your player, you're going to need a plugin on WordPress to get this little thing that you can hit play and it makes noise, right? There are a whole number of them. I think the one that people are using right now, it's Blueberry is what it's called. That's the one that's most popular among my podcasting friends. I haven't played with it. I will be playing with it when I change my hosting, so I'll keep you posted on that. Now, YouTube is an interesting one. I did not think I should put my podcast on YouTube because how boring is it to look at a picture of me in a cowboy hat for an hour and 20 minutes while I talk to you about farming stuff. But as it turns out, about 80 people work at their desks, like to listen to podcasts, and they subscribe to a bunch of YouTube channels, and anything that comes out on that channel they listen to. The reason I went up to YouTube was because of a couple of them reached out to me and said, I love your podcast. I forget to listen to it. If I could subscribe on YouTube, I'll listen to it every week. And I put it up and I enabled monetization, and guys, I've earned 25 cents. Yay! Okay, well, the monetization isn't, YouTube views are not the best way to monetize out of the chute, but surprisingly, people will listen to these hour-long episodes on YouTube, and I think it fits into their style. So you might as well put it on YouTube. Don't panic about having visual aids. Unless you have, if you have a short podcast that's like 10 or 15 minutes, you might want to add some visuals to it. For me, it's a long discussion of homesteading things, and it would take me hours and hours and hours to do that for very little value. So if I'm going to do a video that's instructional about, how to preserve food or something, I'm going to do a short video with visuals that somebody might actually watch from beginning to end. So that's a little bit of a word on distribution. Now, promotion. And this actually goes to a question we got in advance. And this is somebody who said, we have a policy/politics themed podcast. The content is outstanding. Good job. With members of the North Carolina House and North Carolina Senate and policy experts coming to the show regularly. I'm pretty sure this is from Civitas Institute, by the way, and that's awesome, guys. You're reaching the people you need to reach. They say content is king, but with so many podcasts out there, how do I get people to listen to the show? So they're using their usual social. Their media reach is only so broad. They're wondering how to build their audience. Great question. So this is sort of like your expanded, you've started the podcast, you can do it all the time. Your content's really good. The people you want to reach you're reaching. So how do you make it bigger? And I would say back to network. Start doing guest blog posts on people's blogs and talk about your podcast. Start bringing people in to interview who also have a really good network. Like I didn't know that I was going to have this much success, and I did not do this interview because I was trying to expand my reach. But all of you know John Papola, who did the Hayek Wrap video. Well, he put out a farm-related documentary called At the Fork. And when I saw that, I was super excited. And I brought him on my show and interviewed him. And that episode has been downloaded 2,000 times. And I didn't see that he shared it, but just if you Google At the Fork and John Papola, my podcast comes up and people listen to it. One time, the first time I exceeded 1,000 downloads in a month, which was a huge deal for me because that's a big benchmark for your podcast. I was like, what is going on? Like, I have 150 listeners right now. How did I exceed 1,000 in 2 days? And I went down and looked, and the At the Fork episode had been downloaded a bunch of times, and they had just done a push of their own, and I benefited. So think about people you can interview that when they promote themselves, you'll just come up in the Google search. Make sure your like your title, this title is, on my blog post is matching with the content and the tags that you have. Like, make sure you're optimized well for Google. If you haven't done an SEO audit on your website where your podcast is distributed, think about doing one and fixing the problems. I've been going through about 25 sites that a friend of mine handles, and even the sites that have like really good professionals maintaining them have big issues with SEO where their titles are too long. And I know SEO is sort of easier now because it's built into WordPress and built into some of the tools we have, but you still need to look at it a couple times a year. And you can get a quick audit and it'll be like, well, you have 147 broken links. These 12 pages aren't even being crawled by Google. Your title and your tags don't match, like your meta tags, all of those things, really easy to fix. And it's a good way to keep you up in the search. So I think that's the first strategy. Second, you might want to look at some paid advertising, like not just on Facebook. Facebook is a very good tool for that, though, where if you're tailoring your audience down, and the Civitas Institute, I know, has put a lot of thought into who they're reaching and why. So guys, good job with that. Like, think about, okay, the topic of our podcast this week is, let's say it's transit policy related. Who in our target audience, like what subset of that is going to be interested in this topic? And especially if it's a really good one, like push it on Facebook, push it. You can even do YouTube ads if you want to. Maybe think out of the box, like Sue Zoldock was talking to us about a couple episodes again, and use Pandora to target some of these people. So they're listening to the radio and then they hear your podcast promoted and have like a little 30-second spot. Like, think about advertising, and then also like cross promote other podcasters in the area and get them to cross promote you, because people who like to listen to podcasts usually listen to more than just one. And so if you can figure out who else they're listening to and get covered on that, like go be interviewed on that podcast, or do a trade-Z with them. Like, I'll promote yours if you promote mine, or just promote those. And usually they'll be like, hey, this person promoted me. Awesome. That happened to me 3 weeks ago. I got 100 more listeners in a week because somebody just liked my podcast and said it on their podcast. So like, those are all ways I would start. And most of my advice right now is the organic growth. Again, the advertising, you can get it out there. I actually have, as I said, I have a paid ad in a newspaper that hits, where is it? It hits people who are interested in the same topics I cover. It took me, like, if you're going to do a paid ad, really think about, do people look at this? And, and here it is. There's the ad. I got a bunch of listeners off that ad the first time, ran it again. We'll see. And a way you can track that, what you always want to do is think, okay, if I put a paid ad in, how am I tracking it? Do some sort of a custom URL. You can put your website up, and that's great. But if you can do something else that leads them to the page, then you'll know how many people you get. If that's too hard to do, though, just think about how advertising fits into your overall strategy. So at this point, guys, that's what I wanted to share with you about getting your podcast started. If you want to look at an organization that does a really good job, it's a company, it's a private company that does a really good job of integrating their top-line communications, their podcast, their website, and their blogging into a cohesive package, go look at Discover Praxis. That's that. I mean, I'm sure you've seen them. That's that. Levi Morehouse, I believe, was the one who started that. It's the internships for kids coming out of high school who do internships and get jobs instead of going to college and going into debt. Their whole package of podcasting, feeding, like generating leads, feeding into their website, feeding into their pipeline is really well thought out. And it's worth, if you're starting a podcast, like go listen to their podcast, go see how they cross promote other things, see how they keep it interesting. They stick to, like one topic per episode, pretty much. And that's kind of cool, because then you can go through and decide which one you're going to listen to. And then they see it as an entry point into their bigger system. So, and like the other thing they do well is pretty much everybody who works there lives the mission. So things they do privately feed the company. If you can put that system together, I think podcasts are a great way to get attention. It's also a platform where you can reach people where they are and bring them along towards what you're doing. Tell the story of why it matters. Because I think something we all as think tankers, sometimes we kind of misfire on this. Like, the work we're doing is really important. And it's really important because it is helping the most vulnerable have opportunities. It's helping those who need help the most get that help. And it's doing it in a way that doesn't hurt a bunch of other people to help one person. Like, that's a good story to tell. So we need to tell it, and a podcast is the best way to do it. So at this point, if anybody has any other questions, just pop them into the Q&A area. If not, we will be wrapping up shortly. I'm going to give it about 30 seconds. As I said, I got a bunch of questions in advance and just tried to build them into the content today. So I'm not sure we'll have a bunch after it. If you do have questions about podcasts for me after this session, we shockingly, Spark Freedom can help you get your podcast set up if you want us to, or just shoot me an email. Like, I'm happy to answer questions. URL of the, okay, so Tracy just asked what the domain name for the website I was just talking about. It is discoverpraxis.com, I believe. I'll pull it up on my screen as soon as I figure out how to use the webinar system here. So these guys rock, Tracy. They're awesome. And the thing about I had them on to talk about the website just because it's so focused on exactly, like, they want you to schedule a call. That's all they really want you to do. A lot of what they do behind the scenes is, it's not on their first page, but look, they're on Fox News. Hey, there's an interview. The way I follow the podcast is I follow Isaac Morehouse. I said Levi earlier. Sorry, Isaac. They're related though, so I follow him on Facebook and I see his podcast come out, and it's always an interesting topic. Oh, look, somebody from Praxis noticed I was there and reached out to me. Like, they have built this whole thing to feed itself, and it's very well done. And I kind of have a website crush on these guys, to be honest. So there you go. Okay, since we don't have any other questions, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. Feel free to shoot me questions when we put out the rewind on this, so you can go back and watch it. I will have links to these things I showed you in the show notes, just about the basic podcast setup. And as I said, always happy to answer questions if I can. If for some reason you email me and I don't answer you within 2 business days, email me again. Sometimes things get lost in spam. Sometimes I get lost in space and come back, and there's a whole bunch of backlogs. So, and I really do like to answer these questions. You're not bothering me at all. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.